Dr. Amanda Miller stared at her holoscreen, fingers drumming against the polished surface of her desk at Terran Defense Intelligence Headquarters. 3 major mercenary companies had just forfeited security deposits worth more credits than most planetary governments saw in a decade. The question was why. Computer, display contract violation report 719. She commanded, leaning forward as the text scrolled across her field of view. The Centaurian Vanguard, renowned for their ruthless efficiency, had withdrawn from a simple patrol contract along the Orion shipping lanes. The Crix Assault Coalition, famous for their siege warfare expertise, had abandoned a planetary defense contract for a mining colony. Most surprisingly, the Drachnid elite forces, who had never broken a contract in their 300-year history, had walked away from a high-profile security detail. Something wasn't adding up. Miller pulled up the combat footage from the Centaurian Vanguard's last engagement. The video showed a standard merchant vessel, human-crewed, minimal armaments, successfully repelling a pirate attack. The Vanguard had been contracted to eliminate the merchant crew after the incident, citing excessive force in their defense. She paused the footage, zooming in on what appeared to be a modified mining laser. The crew had somehow reconfigured it to emit a precise beam capable of slicing through military-grade shields. Ingenious, if technically illegal under 3 different treaties. Dr. Miller. Her assistant's hologram flickered to life beside her desk. Director Reynolds wants to see you immediately. The director's office occupied the top floor of the intelligence complex, its windows overlooking the sprawling Washington metropolis. Reynolds stood with his back to the door, hands clasped behind him as he watched the evening traffic flow through the anti-grav lanes. "Tell me, Doctor," he said without turning, "what do you make of the Crix withdrawal?" Miller straightened her jacket. "Sir, the official report cites unacceptable risk assessment. But that's nonsense. The Crix specialize in high-risk operations. They once assaulted a Magnetar-class defense platform with nothing but boarding pods and plasma cutters. And yet they're afraid of a handful of miners." Reynolds turned, his expression unreadable. "Not afraid, sir. Cautious. The combat logs show the mining colony repelled 3 separate probe attacks using recycled terraforming equipment. They somehow converted atmospheric processors into weaponized gas dispensers. The Crix lost 67 troops without ever breaching the perimeter." Reynolds nodded slowly. "And the Drachnids. That's where it gets interesting." Miller projected a hologram between them, showing a diplomatic transport under attack. The security detail they abandoned. It was protecting an alien delegation from human space. The Drachnids claimed they couldn't guarantee the delegate's safety from their own security forces. "Explain." The human crew demonstrated what the Drachnids termed concerning tactical adaptability during a training exercise. Apparently, our people identified 37 potential ways to turn the ship's own security systems against the Drachnid guards. The delegation requested a non-human security detail within the hour. Reynolds smiled faintly. "And what's your analysis, Doctor?" "These aren't isolated incidents," Miller said, bringing up a galactic map dotted with similar contract breaches. "Over the past standard year, mercenary companies have been systematically avoiding contracts involving human targets. The pattern suggests..." She hesitated. "Go on." "It suggests they're afraid of us, sir. Not our weapons or our ships. They're afraid of how we think, how we fight. The Centaurians cited our barbaric improvisation. The Crix mentioned our disturbing tactical flexibility. The Drachnids actually used the phrase psychologically unpredictable." Reynolds walked to his desk, activating a secure comm channel. "Congratulations, Doctor. You've just identified what might be the most significant shift in interspecies relations since first contact. I'm assigning you to head Project Mirror. Full access, unlimited resources. Find out exactly why the galaxy's most hardened warriors are suddenly afraid of picking fights with humans." Miller felt a chill run down her spine. "Sir, if these mercenary companies are actively avoiding human contracts, Then someone's been spreading stories about us, Reynolds finished. Stories that make battle-hardened aliens prefer bankruptcy to facing human opponents. Your job is to find out if those stories are true. He paused, fixing her with a steady gaze. And if they're not, to figure out who's telling them, and why. As Miller left the director's office, her mind raced with possibilities. Something had the galaxy's deadliest warriors running scared, and she had a feeling she was just scratching the surface of humanity's newfound reputation. The Europan outpost emerged from the icy surface like a skeletal hand reaching for the stars. Dr. Miller watched through the shuttle's viewport as they approached, noting the extensive modifications to what had once been a standard Federation research station. The retired Praxian commander she sought had clearly been busy. Landing clearance granted. The shuttle's AI announced. Commander Vexkar is awaiting your arrival in Observation Module 7. Miller gathered her materials, double-checking the classified dossier. The Praxians were legendary warriors, their calcium-based exoskeletons, and natural resistance to vacuum, making them ideal space combatants, which made Vexkar's presence here, hiding in the outer solar system, all the more intriguing. The airlock cycled, and Miller found herself in a chamber clearly designed for multiple species. The temperature was kept just above freezing, comfortable for Praxians, barely tolerable for humans. In the center of the room, a massive figure stood watching Jupiter's swirling storms through a reinforced viewport. Commander Vexkar. Miller approached, her breath visible in the cold air. I'm Dr. Amanda Miller, Terran Defense Intelligence. The Praxian turned, his crystalline exoskeleton catching the light. Deep scratches and impact marks told stories of countless battles. You're here about Perseus Station, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, you're the only surviving officer from that engagement. The records show your company withdrew from all human-related contracts afterward. I need to know why. Vexkar's outer mandibles clicked, a sound Miller recognized as nervous laughter. Have you ever seen a mining laser converted into a particle accelerator, Doctor? Not a crude weapon, a precise instrument of death, calibrated to exploit the exact resonant frequency of Praxian armor. Miller activated her recorder. The miners did this. Miners. Engineers. Technicians. Does it matter? They were human. We breached their outer defenses, as planned. Tactical doctrine suggested they would surrender once we controlled their life support systems. The commander's crystalline fingers traced one of his deeper scars. Instead, they turned the entire facility into a weapon. How? They vented specific sections to vacuum, creating killing zones, redirected waste heat from the reactor to boil entire corridors. The maintenance drones. He clicked again, but there was no humor in it now. They reprogrammed them to detect our crystalline biology, turned our own thermal signatures against us. Each time we adapted, they had 3 new countermeasures ready. Miller leaned forward. But your forces had superior numbers, training, and equipment. Numbers. Vexkar turned back to the viewport. When you fight most species, numbers matter. Resources matter. You can calculate victory probabilities based on force disposition and tactical advantages. But humans, he trailed off. Go on. Humans don't calculate odds, Doctor. They deny them. We had them trapped, outnumbered, outgunned. By any logical assessment, they had lost. That's when they became most dangerous. The commander's outer shell rippled, a sign of deep distress. They initiated reactor overload sequences, turned the atmospheric processors into chemical weapon dispensers, made their defeat so costly that victory became meaningless. A suicide gambit? Miller asked. No, that's what haunts me. They had escape routes planned. Contingencies. Even as they turned their facility into a death trap, they maintained multiple survival options. They weren't trying to die gloriously. They were daring us to die ingloriously. Miller checked her notes. Your company lost 60% of its forces before withdrawing. We lost more than forces, Doctor. We lost certainty. The galaxy operates on understood principles. Species act according to their nature. Prey flees. Predators pursue. The strong survive. Vexcar's crystalline hands clenched. But humans reject nature itself. They turn defeat into advantage, make their very environment fight for them, transform tools of creation into weapons of war. Is that why you're here? Miller gestured at the isolated station, hiding from human space. Studying, Vexcar corrected. Learning. Your species fascinates me, even as it terrifies me. Did you know this station's life support could be converted into a plasma distribution system within 17 minutes? I've counted the ways. I can't stop counting the ways. That's what humans do to you. Make you see weapons in everything. As Miller left the station, she reviewed her recording. The pieces were starting to fit together, not just why mercenaries feared human contracts, but why that fear was spreading. Every defeated force carried stories back to their worlds, tales of an enemy that turned the laws of nature against you. The real question was, had humanity earned this reputation, or had they simply failed to deny it? The holographic display in Miller's office flared to life, projecting combat footage from a dozen different engagements. She'd spent weeks compiling these records, each showing human forces achieving what alien military doctrine deemed impossible. Computer, play Incident 734, she commanded. The largest projection showed a cargo freighter, the Star Dancer, surrounded by manted raider vessels. Standard doctrine suggested immediate surrender. The mantids were notorious for leaving crews alive to maximize ransoms. Instead, the human captain had vented their entire cargo hold of industrial lubricant into space, then ignited it with their navigation lights. The resulting chemical reaction had created an expanding plasma cloud that melted through 3 raider ships before they could raise shields. Pause footage, Miller muttered, adding notes to her growing database. Computer, cross-reference with Incident 912. A new projection appeared, showing security footage from a colonial mining outpost. A human security team, outgunned and outnumbered by Centaurian mercenaries, had modified their excavation charges into sonic weapons, calibrated to the exact frequency that disrupted Centaurian neural patterns. Dr. Miller. Her office door slid open, revealing Admiral Chen. The Joint Chiefs are asking about your progress. Miller gestured at the floating displays. It's not just isolated incidents anymore, sir. I'm seeing patterns, but not the kind we expected. The Admiral raised an eyebrow. Explain. Look here, Miller brought up a tactical analysis grid. When other species engage in combat, they follow established doctrines. The Praxians always strike at command and control first. The Mantids focus on disabling enemy weapons. The Centaurians prioritize systematic territory control. And humans, we don't have a pattern. That is the pattern. Miller highlighted various incidents. A maintenance crew turns clinging supplies into chemical weapons. A mining team weaponizes industrial equipment. A civilian transport converts its cargo into an improvised missile. There's no way to predict how humans will react, because they adapt their tactics to whatever resources are available. Admiral Chen studied the displays. This hardly seems groundbreaking, Doctor. Improvised warfare is as old as humanity itself. But that's just it, sir. Miller pulled up xenobiological data. Other species can improvise, but it costs them. Stress and danger trigger evolutionary responses that degrade their cognitive functions. They fall back on training, on established patterns. But humans, she highlighted brain scan comparisons. We get more creative under pressure, more innovative. The worse the situation gets, the more solutions we see. You're saying we're at our most dangerous when we're about to lose. Exactly. Look at this. Miller played another clip, showing a human mining colony under siege. The defenders were down to their last supplies. No ammunition, no heavy weapons. So they rerouted power from their shield generators into the mining lasers, created a feedback loop that turned their entire defensive grid into a directional energy weapon. The attacking force never even considered that possibility because it required deliberately sacrificing their own protection. The Admiral frowned. And this makes us unpredictable. It makes us terrifying, Miller corrected. Other species see equipment and understand its intended purpose. Humans see equipment and imagine a dozen ways to repurpose it as a weapon. We don't just break the rules of engagement. We reject the very concept that rules exist in survival situations. She brought up her statistical analysis. In the past standard year, engagements involving human forces have shown a 70% increase in what alien tacticians call irrational success. Victories achieved through methods that their military doctrine classified as impossible or suicidal. And yet we survived, Admiral Chen noted. More than survived. We're reshaping how the galaxy thinks about warfare. Miller displayed a series of classified alien military advisories. Look at these new combat protocols. Multiple species are now requiring additional forces when engaging human targets, not because of our superior technology or numbers, but because they can't predict how we'll fight back. The Admiral finished. This could change everything about our position in galactic politics. Miller nodded. Sir, I recommend we expand this investigation. There's something bigger here than just mercenary companies avoiding contracts. The galaxy is developing a very specific fear of human combat capability, and I need to know if someone is deliberately encouraging that fear. As the Admiral left her office, Miller turned back to the combat footage. Each incident showed humans breaking the established rules of warfare, turning defeat into victory through methods other species considered unnatural or aberrant. The question wasn't whether humanity deserved its growing reputation. The question was whether that reputation was their greatest weapon of all. The Joint Chiefs sat in stunned silence as Miller concluded her presentation. The holographic display above the conference table showed a disturbing progression of alien psychological responses to human combat tactics. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. General Rodriguez leaned forward, his weathered face illuminated by the projections. You're saying we haven't just been winning battles. We've been breaking their understanding of how battles should be fought. Miller nodded, bringing up footage from the Proxima Centauri conflict. Watch this engagement. Standard Drachnid assault protocol calls for systematic shield penetration followed by precision strikes. They've used the same tactics for 3 centuries because they work. Against everyone except us. The footage showed a human research vessel, cornered by Drachnid warships. Rather than surrender, the crew had ejected their antimatter fuel containment pods, then used their point defense lasers to detonate them in sequence, creating a cascading wave of explosions that overloaded the Drachnid shields. The Drachnids lost 4 ships in that engagement, Miller continued. But more importantly, they lost their certainty. Their after-action report describes human tactics as fundamentally incomprehensible from a strategic perspective. Admiral Chen spoke up. Doctor, weren't those containment pods worth more than the ship itself? Exactly. Miller highlighted the economic analysis. Every alien combat doctrine is built around preserving strategic assets. The idea of sacrificing expensive equipment to save cheaper assets doesn't just confuse them, it terrifies them. They can't formulate effective battle plans because we don't follow their cost-benefit logic. Show them the neural patterns, Director Reynolds prompted from his seat in the shadows. Miller switched the display to a series of comparative brain scans. This is where it gets interesting. When most sentient species engage in combat, their neural activity shows predictable patterns. Stress triggers instinctive responses, narrowing their tactical options. But human brains, she highlighted the differences. We experience neural pathway expansion under threat. The worse our situation becomes, the more creative solutions we generate. You're saying we think better when we're about to die? General Rodriguez asked. We think differently, Miller corrected. Other species see a fuel pod as a power source because that's its designed purpose. Humans see it as a power source, a bomb, a radiation shield, a thruster, or anything else we can imagine. We're not just adapting to situations, we're reinventing the basic rules of what equipment can do. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Finally, Admiral Chen spoke. "What are your recommendations, Doctor?" Miller straightened. "First, we need to understand if this reputation is actually beneficial. The galaxy's greatest warriors are becoming reluctant to engage human forces, but fear can lead to preemptive action. Second, we need to investigate whether someone is deliberately cultivating this perception of humanity." "Explain." Director Reynolds leaned forward. "These stories are spreading too perfectly." Miller displayed a galactic communication analysis. Every time human forces achieve an impossible victory, the story spreads along exact paths to reach maximum psychological impact. It's almost as if someone wants the galaxy to fear us. General Rodriguez finished. "Precisely. The question is whether that fear makes us safer or puts us at greater risk." Miller brought up her final projection, a map showing the spreading pattern of alien psychological responses to human combat capabilities. "We're becoming the monster under their beds, the irrational force that turns their own technology against them. Every species has combat doctrines designed to counter superior forces, but none of them know how to fight an enemy that transforms civilian equipment into weapons of mass destruction." "And your conclusion?" Admiral Chen pressed. Miller took a deep breath. "We need to decide whether to correct this perception or enhance it. Right now, the galaxy's most powerful mercenary companies would rather go bankrupt than face human defenders. That's an incredible tactical advantage, unless it convinces them we're too dangerous to let survive." As the Joint Chiefs debated the implications, Miller watched the combat footage continue to play. Each incident showed humans achieving victory through methods other species considered impossible or insane. They were rewriting the rules of warfare not through superior technology or numbers, but through their fundamental inability to accept the limitations that other species took for granted. The galaxy was learning to fear humanity not for what they could build, but for what they could imagine. The question was whether that fear would be their shield or their undoing. The Drachnid survivors huddled in the quarantine chamber of Lunar Base 7, their scaled forms trembling despite the carefully regulated temperature. Miller watched through the observation window as medical staff treated their injuries. These weren't the proud warriors she'd read about in intelligence briefings. They looked broken. "How many survived?" she asked the attending physician. 7 out of a crew of 30, Dr. Harrison replied, checking his datapad. "They're physically stable, but their psychological trauma is significant. Whatever happened out there shattered their combat conditioning." Miller activated her recorder. "I need to interview the captain." The Drachnid captain, Scale Commander Vexthal, sat hunched in the interrogation room. His ceremonial armor, normally polished to a mirror shine, was scared and pitted. He didn't look up when Miller entered. "Tell me about the merchant vessel," she said, taking a seat across from him. "The Prairie Wind." Vexthal's voice rasped. "A human agricultural transport. Minimal weapons. No military-grade shields. An easy target for routine inspection under anti-smuggling protocols." Miller pulled up the ship's registry. "You outmassed them 10-1. Your cruiser carried enough firepower to level a small city." None of that mattered. The Drachnid scales rippled, a sign of severe distress. They were carrying industrial fertilizer. Do you understand? Simple farming chemicals. What did they do with it? They vented it into space, created a chemical cloud. But that wasn't the worst part. Vexthal's claws dug into the table. They modified their crop irrigation systems to electrify the cloud. The resulting plasma reaction. He trailed off, mandibles clicking rapidly. Miller checked the damage reports. "You lost your primary weapons array." "Lost." "They transformed our own shields against us. The electromagnetic cascade turned our defense systems into conductors. Every time we strengthened our shields, the reaction intensified." The Drachnid captain finally met her eyes. "Who thinks like that? What kind of species looks at farming equipment and sees a weapon that can cripple a warship?" "What happened next?" "We tried to retreat. Standard doctrine calls for strategic withdrawal when facing unknown weapon systems. But Vexthal's scales rattled. They launched their hydroponics pods at us, simple greenhouse modules filled with water and organic matter. The impact velocity turned them into kinetic penetrators. Each hit released superheated steam into our hull breaches. My crew, the screams. Miller kept her voice steady. Why didn't you surrender? Would you surrender to an enemy that transforms farming equipment into weapons of mass destruction? That looks at life-giving systems and sees new ways to kill. The Drachnid's voice cracked. We're warriors. We understand combat. But humans, you don't fight like warriors. You fight like what? Like the universe itself is your weapon, Vexthal whispered. Everything is a potential threat. Anything can be turned against us. How do you fight an enemy that doesn't accept the basic rules of what technology is supposed to do? Later, in her office, Miller compiled her interview notes. The pattern was becoming clearer and more disturbing. It wasn't human military might that terrified other species. It was human creativity. Their fundamental inability to accept any technology as having limited applications. Her computer chimed with a priority alert. Another mercenary company had just breached their contracts rather than engage human targets. The penalty fees would bankrupt them, but they didn't care. The company commander's official statement was telling. No payment is worth facing an enemy that turns the tools of life into the instruments of death. Miller started her official report. Human combat effectiveness appears to stem from a unique psychological trait. The inability to accept technological limitations. While other species optimize their equipment for specific purposes, humans consistently demonstrate the ability to repurpose any technology as a weapon system. This adaptability, combined with enhanced cognitive function under stress, makes human forces effectively impossible to predict or counter through conventional military doctrine. She paused, considering her next words carefully. Humanity's growing reputation was reshaping galactic politics, but not in ways anyone had anticipated. They weren't feared for their strength or their technology. They were feared because, in human hands, everything was a weapon. And that made the entire universe their arsenal. The Pentagon's Xenological Warfare Analysis Chamber hummed with activity as Miller prepared her presentation. Holograms flickered across the room, showing various human-alien engagements that had reshaped galactic military doctrine. Dr. Miller, General Rodriguez gestured to the assembled military leaders and synopsychologists. Show us what you found. Miller activated the central display, bringing up footage from the Perseus incident. What you're about to see fundamentally challenges everything we thought we knew about human combat effectiveness. The display showed a human mining crew, cornered by Centaurian elite forces, turning their entire facility into an electromagnetic trap. But instead of focusing on the battle, Miller highlighted the miners' neural patterns. Notice the spike in creative problem-solving during peak stress moments. She traced the readings. When the miners realized they were cut off from reinforcements, their cognitive function didn't deteriorate, it expanded. They didn't just fight back. They reinvented the basic principles of their equipment's purpose. Admiral Chen leaned forward. We've seen humans repurpose technology before. What makes this different? Because it's not just about winning battles anymore. Miller switched to diplomatic communications intercepts. Look at the response from the Galactic Council. Every time humans demonstrate this capability, we don't just defeat our enemies, we shatter their fundamental understanding of how technology should work. She brought up comparison footage. Other species optimize their equipment. They perfect its intended purpose. Humans, we see a mining laser and imagine a dozen ways to modify it. We look at life support systems and calculate how to turn them into weapons. Every tool is a potential arsenal, and this frightens them. A synapsychologist asked. It terrifies them, Miller corrected. But here's the crucial part. Our greatest victories aren't coming from superior firepower or tactics. They're coming from what happens after we win. The display shifted to show aftermath reports. When the mining crew survived, they didn't just defeat the Centaurians. They proved that humans could turn civilian equipment into weapons capable of defeating elite military forces. The psychological impact rippled through the entire mercenary community. But surely other species can improvise too, General Rodriguez interjected. Miller shook her head. Not like us. Watch this. She played footage from the Europa Defense Station incident. The human security team was outnumbered 6-1. Standard doctrine said they couldn't win. But instead of accepting those limitations, the footage showed the defenders reprogramming atmospheric processors to create localized gravity fluctuations, turning their entire facility into a weapon. They didn't just survive. They proved that humans can reject the basic laws of how technology should be used. Every defeat we inflict doesn't just cost our enemy ships and soldiers. It costs them their certainty. Admiral Chen's expression darkened. You're suggesting this could backfire. Exactly. Miller highlighted diplomatic communications. Fear is spreading through the galactic community. Not fear of our military might, but fear of our fundamental nature. Every species has protocols for dealing with superior forces. None of them know how to handle an enemy that transforms civilian infrastructure into weapons of mass destruction. She brought up her final analysis. We're reaching a breaking point. The galaxy's most hardened warriors are choosing bankruptcy over facing human forces. Mercenary companies are writing human exclusion clauses into their contracts. But this fear, she paused, letting the implications sink in. This fear could unite them against us. Your recommendations? General Rodriguez asked. We need to control this narrative, Miller replied. Right now, our reputation is spreading organically through battle reports and survivor accounts. But if we don't manage how the galaxy perceives us, this fear could turn from a tactical advantage into a strategic threat. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Humanity had achieved something unprecedented. They'd become the species that other species were afraid to fight. Not because of their weapons or their numbers, but because they represented something unpredictable, something that broke the established rules of warfare. Continue your analysis, Doctor, Admiral Chen finally said. We need to understand if this reputation truly makes us safer, or if we're just convincing the galaxy that we're too dangerous to let survive. As the meeting adjourned, Miller watched the combat footage continue to play. Each incident showed humans achieving victory by rejecting the limitations that other species accepted without question. They weren't just winning battles, they were rewriting the rules of what was possible. And that, she realized, might be the most dangerous weapon of all. The Galactic Council's emergency session chamber pulsed with nervous energy as Miller watched the proceedings through a secure feed. Representatives from 17 spacefaring civilizations argued in their native tongues, their translators struggling to keep up with the heated debate. The humans must be contained. The Praxian delegates' crystalline form shimmered with agitation. Their psychological profile makes them an existential threat to galactic stability. Miller glanced at Director Reynolds, seated beside her in the observation room at Earth's diplomatic embassy. They've spent 6 hours debating our threat classification. Because they can't agree on what we are, Reynolds replied, studying the alien diplomats. Look at the Centaurian representative. They want to classify us as a military threat. But the Drachnids are pushing for something unprecedented. On the council floor, the Drachnid ambassador rose to speak, his scarred scales reflecting the chamber's lights. We propose classification Omega-7. Species of categorical concern. The humans don't just possess dangerous technology. They transform all technology into dangers we cannot predict or counter. Miller's research files floated across her datapad. Incident reports, combat footage, psychological analyses. They're not afraid of our weapons, she noted. They're afraid of our minds. The human ability to repurpose civilian technology exceeds known parameters, the mantid representative chittered. Their neural responses to combat stress defy evolutionary logic. When threatened, they don't become less efficient. They become more innovative, more lethal. The chamber erupted in multilingual debate. Miller watched species that had been enemies for centuries finding common ground in their fear of humanity's potential. Display the Proxima Centauri incident, the Centaurian delegate demanded. The chamber's holographic system showed the now infamous footage of a human mining vessel destroying 3 military cruisers by weaponizing their mineral processing equipment. A civilian vessel, the Drachnid ambassador emphasized, with no military capabilities. And yet they transformed basic industrial technology into a weapon that breached military-grade defenses. This is why standard threat classifications are insufficient. Miller leaned forward as new data scrolled across her screen. "Sir, I'm detecting unusual communication patterns. These species, they're sharing military intelligence, comparing notes on human combat encounters." Reynolds nodded grimly. "Fear is doing what diplomacy couldn't. They're cooperating." Motion to classify humanity as an Omega-level threat, the Praxian delegate announced, requiring immediate containment protocols and restricted access to advanced technology. The vote count appeared above the chamber. Species after species registered their agreement. "This is bad," Miller muttered, running scenarios. "If they restrict our access to alien technology." "They're not trying to restrict our access to their technology," Reynolds interrupted. "They're trying to restrict our access to any technology. They've realized that humans can turn virtually anything into a weapon." The Council Chamber's AI announced the final tally. Motion carried. Human species officially classified as Omega-7 threat category. Containment protocols to be implemented immediately. Miller's datapad chimed with priority updates as the classification rippled through Galactic communications. Mercenary companies were canceling contracts. Trade agreements were being rewritten. Diplomatic missions were being recalled. "Sir," she turned to Reynolds, "this changes everything. Our reputation for unpredictability was providing a strategic advantage. But this level of fear," she gestured at the diplomatic feeds, "they're uniting against us." Reynolds smiled faintly. "Are they, Doctor? Look closer at the containment protocols they're proposing." Miller scanned the documentation, her eyes widening. "These aren't military restrictions. They're appeasement measures. They're not trying to fight us. They're trying to keep us happy." "Precisely." Reynolds stood, watching the alien diplomats rush to implement their new protocols. "They've convinced themselves that humanity is too dangerous to confront directly. So instead, they're going to give us everything we want." Miller finished, understanding dawning. "Trade concessions, technological access, diplomatic privileges, anything to prevent us from feeling threatened." "Fear can be a more effective weapon than any fleet," Reynolds noted, "especially when your enemies convince themselves that you're too dangerous to fight." As they left the observation room, Miller thought about her research. She had started investigating why mercenaries feared human contracts. Instead, she had documented humanity's emergence as a force that reshaped galactic politics not through strength, but through the galaxy's fear of their potential. The question was no longer whether humanity deserved its fearsome reputation. The question was whether they could control what that reputation would make them become. Miller stood at the viewport of her office, watching Earth's defense fleet conduct routine exercises. The ships moved with practiced precision, but she now understood that their real power lay not in their weapons, but in the galaxy's fear of how humans might use them. Her computer chimed with an incoming priority message. Director Reynolds' hologram materialized beside her desk. "Dr. Miller, your final report." She turned from the viewport, activating her findings display. "Sir, after 6 months of investigation, I can confirm that humanity's reputation as an Omega-level threat was neither accidental nor entirely organic in its spread." "Explain." Miller brought up a complex web of communication patterns. "Someone has been carefully cultivating the galaxy's fear of human combat capabilities. When I traced the spread of stories about human victories, I found too many perfect coincidences. The display showed how tales of human ingenuity had reached key military and political figures across multiple species, each story strategically placed to maximize psychological impact. Look at the Perseus Station incident. She highlighted one node. The surviving Praxian mercenaries all received anonymous data packets containing footage of humans turning other civilian facilities into weapons. Their subsequent reports to their high command emphasized patterns they might have otherwise overlooked. Reynolds nodded slowly. And you've identified the source. That's the interesting part, sir. Miller pulled up her security clearance. I needed ultraviolet access to find it. The pattern leads back to us, specifically to Project Lighthouse. I'm not familiar with that designation, because officially it doesn't exist. Miller displayed classified communications dating back decades. Shortly after first contact, a group within our intelligence community realized something crucial. Humanity's greatest defense wouldn't be our weapons or our ships. It would be the galaxy's fear of how we think. Understanding dawned in Reynolds' eyes. We've been spreading our own legend. Carefully, subtly. Every time humans won an engagement through unconventional means, Project Lighthouse made sure the story reached the right audiences. They didn't have to exaggerate. They just had to ensure our enemies focused on the psychological implications. She brought up psychological analysis of various species. Other races see technology as having defined purposes. When humans demonstrate the ability to repurpose anything as a weapon, it doesn't just frighten them. It fundamentally challenges their understanding of reality. And now they've classified us as an Omega-level threat, Reynolds mused, making us too dangerous to fight. Exactly. The galaxy's most powerful civilizations are now committed to appeasing us, not because of our military might, but because they're convinced we're fundamentally unpredictable. Miller paused. The question is, what do we do with this information? Reynolds studied the data. Your recommendation? We maintain the illusion, Miller said firmly, not because we need to deceive them, but because their fear is based on truth. Humans do think differently. We do see possibilities where they see limitations. That's not propaganda. It's our nature. She gestured at the exercise fleet outside. Our ships aren't our greatest defense. Our reputation is. As long as the galaxy believes we can turn anything into a weapon, they'll hesitate to move against us. That hesitation gives us room to grow, to explore, to establish ourselves as a permanent part of the galactic community. And if they discover Project Lighthouse? Miller smiled. That's the beautiful part, sir. Even if they learn we've been encouraging their fear, it won't matter. Every story we've spread is true. Every human victory we've highlighted actually happened. We're not deceiving them about our capabilities. We're just making sure they draw the right conclusions. Reynolds' hologram nodded. Prepare your final report, Doctor, but classify everything about Project Lighthouse. Let the galaxy continue to believe their fear of us is entirely their own idea. After he disconnected, Miller turned back to the viewport. The exercise fleet was finishing its maneuvers, each ship moving with carefully choreographed precision. But she knew now that their true power lay not in their weapons, but in the galaxy's certainty that humans would find ways to use them that no other species would imagine possible. Fear, properly cultivated, had become humanity's greatest shield. Not because they had deceived the galaxy, but because they had helped other species understand a fundamental truth. In human hands, everything was a potential weapon. And that made the entire universe their arsenal.